I'm going to show you a game where I lost with black in the Kalashnikov, or the start of the Kalashnikov, in 22 moves. This was the start of the game. Now, I was around about 11 years old. One of the first games I probably played with this opening. And I have to say, I'd shoved this game to the back of my mind. I'd really forgotten about the details of this catastrophe until very recently, when it appeared in this mighty work. Let me just check you can see this okay. Let me see the screen. There we go. Yup. Off the Board Chess. The Best Games and Chess Experiences of Andrew Smith. This is a huge book crammed with games and anecdotes. It is absolutely hilarious. It's entertaining. Some of the stories are absolutely outrageous. It's an amazing book. It really is. So it's written by Andrew Smith, who's a stalwart on the London chess scene. We both grew up in southeast London, lived fairly close to each other, so we played quite a few times. And well, the book is full of Andy's games, and he's a fearless, bold player, and some of the games are just absolutely wild rides. They really are. And in the book, he gives a picture of the kind of the London chess scene with all the sort of extraordinary characters. It's a really entertaining book. Also, Andy has some very interesting opening systems that he's sort of honed over years, and he goes into some detail in those, and that's also very interesting actually. So it's an amazing book actually. So back to this game. This is actually game number 1 in the book. And it was kind of a shock for me to relive this game after almost 50 years, particularly as I got wiped off the board, as we're going to see. My score sheet obviously got chucked in the bin before I was even outside the school gates. It was played in a schools match, so it's, let me see, St Austin's School, that's where Andy was, against Langley Park School, that's where I was, and played in the Sunday Times knockout competition, so a schools competition. So Andy's, I think, about 3 years older than I am, so I think at that age it probably makes a bit of a difference. Anyway, it certainly did in this game. Now, Andy says in his annotations that he kind of knew this wasn't the best move, but he wanted to sort of test me out a bit. The best move is knight b5, but not everyone is willing to go into the complications that arise after this. Anyway, knight b3. So I played knight f6, knight c3, bishop b4. And I've had this position certainly in club chess years ago on so many occasions, and I already think that black stands better actually. Bishop d3 guards that pawn, and here there are two quite distinct ways that black can tackle this position. So in the game I took on c3, which I like, but I also like d5, and this is actually the move that I recommend in my Kalashnikov book and the Chessable course. There we go. I've got to show my book now. There we go. Make sure you see that. There we go. So yeah, I actually recommend d5. I call this pawn break in the book and in the course Liberation Station. All aboard, get on board. Black liberates really the pieces here and gets a nice pawn majority in the centre. Already after this, I feel black is doing pretty well because, you know, obviously white's pawns have been shattered, and this is quite a nice kingside pawn majority. Often you can get the steamroller going down the board with f and e pawns. But there's nothing wrong with bishop takes knight as I played. But here, I played a move. Well, I don't like it. I don't like it at all. I've mentioned this kind of thing before. As I've said on many occasions, there is a special place in hell reserved for players who make these little pawn moves at the side of the board. And it looks like I'm going to be joining their ranks in that special place. I just don't like these moves. Every move in the opening should count. Development is so important. Now, having given up this dark squared bishop, I was obviously concerned about that pin. In fact, there is really nothing to be concerned about. I'll just give you one little example. d6. And if bishop g5, you can just drive that bishop away. Because after this move, well, you certainly don't mind about an exchange. And after bishop h4, black can just break the pin with g5 and bishop e6. The problem is, this bishop is kind of stuck. This is a very solid pawn front, actually. So white is not going to get in f4. h4 doesn't really matter that much. And these pieces just can't get over to the king side. And black can, well, play in two ways, really. You can play by attacking down the c-file, play against that weak pawn. Or, and this one I really like, you can switch the knight to the king side and actually start a kingside attack, or even combine it with play on the c-file. I really like putting the knight on g6 because that just bolsters the king side as well. White's king is potentially in trouble there. So I think that is the way to play simple chess, just d6. The bishop can pop out to a3, but this is completely different to the game, as we'll see. Because black is basically a tempo up, and of course there's certainly no need to play h6 here when there's no bishop g5 happening. You'll see what I mean. So h6, I don't like that move at all. Bishop a3, how very sensible. So the bishop comes to a good diagonal. d6, and we both castled. And now queen e1. Good move. Andy has a very clear idea of attacking. He wants to play f4 and bring his queen over to the king side. Very sensible. It also makes room for that rook to come to d1, so I really like queen e1. So I realised that this pawn was going to be attacked, so I played the queen to c7, and after this I just made room for the rook to defend that pawn. Now here, if white doesn't react quickly, then basically because of these weak pawns, I think black is just better. You're going to build up with the bishop and maybe put the knight round here again and start attacking on the c-file. So it's really essential that white starts attacking. And I think f4 is such a natural move now that the rook has been dragged over, away from protecting f7, for example. And with the queen away from d8, then that knight is vulnerable as well. So, I don't know how I was feeling at the time, probably quite nervous. I'm looking at this and I'm feeling nervous for black here. Because, white's pieces are just revving up beautifully here. In fact, it's still okay for black, incredibly. For example, if black takes and just plays queen e7. Now, the big danger here, once that pawn has gone from e5, is that this knight will enter the game. But actually, after this move, that queen is really nicely placed on e5 and, attacks two things there. In fact, black is still absolutely fine. Look at white's pawns. They're not too clever. So if white's initiative peters out, then black is doing very well positionally. But I played bishop e6, which looks very dangerous. Of course, very often the bishop wants to go to e6, but in this position, when the rook is lining up against that knight, I'm just thinking, oh my god, that's a little bit casual. So queen h4 sends the queen over. Why not? And here I played a move which, to my eyes now, I just kind of go, what? I gave up the bishop for the knight. Now, I don't like to do that at the best of times, but here, when this knight is way out of play on the queen side, it just looks weird to exchange off bishop for knight. In fact, there was a point to it, as we'll see in a moment. But yeah, I still don't like it. And in fact, it's still possible to take here and then get this knight out of the way quickly. So, you know, one of these knights wants to end up on e5. And in fact, this is playable because even after... The point is, knight d4 would actually terrify me. But there's a little tactic. Black can exchange and play queen c3, hitting the bishop and hitting this pawn. And once the queen takes the pawn with check, then it's actually able to defend on the king side. So, yeah, remarkably, although this looks terrifying, in fact, it's still okay for black. But I don't like bishop takes knight at all. Although, apparently black might still be okay in this position. So, at least I'm swinging this knight round to the king side. At least I sensed that there was some danger here. And the knight can be a good defensive piece on g6. Pawn takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. And now, yeah, a very natural sacrifice. Rook takes knight. I suspect, well, I know that I completely underestimated this exchange sacrifice. I think in those days I was very materialistic. So if queen takes pawn, then the knight will sit on g6. So that's not too bad. But rook f1, you know, I think that's a really sensible move. Instead of just using the queen, why not bring the rook over? Seems like a really good idea. So I played knight g6. And now if queen takes pawn, I think this was my idea in getting rid of this bishop. Because black can exchange queens. It's check. I think that's I'm just guessing. That's probably why I wanted to exchange off bishop for knight. But Andy took on h6 instead. I mean, this looks unbelievably dangerous, but black is still okay here. Now, as I said, I think I was a very materialistic player in those days. And I think if I'd been willing to give up material like this, in fact, black is okay here. You know, this bishop isn't joining the attack very quickly. And yes, the queen looks quite impressive, but you know, white's king is also a little bit insecure, and so it's hard to bring this rook into the game. And in fact, yeah, black is still all right in that position. I took on c3 immediately, and that allowed the bishop to slip away. Now this is starting to look very dangerous, and I'm afraid I didn't appreciate the danger at all. So what should black play here? Your move. Black to play. I'll have a drink, you have a think. Cheers. Black to play. What should black play here? Well, amazingly, black is still all right if that check is given. And then queen takes pawn, which guards the knight on g6. There's a pin here, so the knight had to be defended. And black is actually okay in that position. Once again, it's not easy for this rook to come into the game because there's a weak back rank. And black is actually surviving there. But instead of that, I sensed that it was time to counterattack. I threw this knight into the game. You know, I'm looking at this. Obviously, I saw queen takes knight and thought, okay, this doesn't look bad. And yeah, doesn't seem like a bad move. It is a terrible move because I'd completely overlooked white's next. Over to you again, white to play. What's the move? Bishop takes pawn check, and that was the end of that. Well, that's justice, I think, for giving up my beautiful light squared bishop. And after queen h7 check, I resigned. If the king goes to e8 or e6, doesn't matter. Queen e7 is checkmate. Well, I think an excellent attacking game by Andy Smith there. You know, his moves looked very natural, very straightforward. You know, bishop a3, queen e1 and rook d1 and f4. You know, everything sort of heading in the right direction. And yeah, basically I failed to appreciate the danger. And as I said, at that time, I think certainly in my early teenage years, I was a very materialistic player, and I really underestimated sacrifices. And yeah, I paid the price there. And going back, there is nothing wrong with this, but you know, h6, it wastes a move. So for example, if I'd played d6, black plays d6 here, and then white tries the same thing with bishop a3, and let's say queen e1, well, this makes a huge difference actually, that black has gained a tempo. You know, you don't really want the pawn on h6 anyway. It doesn't add anything to black's defensive position. So black is basically a tempo up on the game. And even in the game, I could have defended. And going way back, d5 liberates black's position. All the details you'll find in my Kalashnikov book, and indeed my Chessable course as well. I'll put links down in the comments and in the video description. And if you want to get Andrew Smith's book, Off the Board Chess, which is, as I said, it's one of the most entertaining chess books I've ever read, then I'll put the link to the Chess and Bridge shop in London, and you can actually buy it online. And yeah, well worth it. Thanks for watching.